it's quite clear that Labour can't bring themselves to even condemn these strikes, which are going to cause total misery tomorrow and throughout the week, with people not able to get to work, to hospital appointments, to GCSE and A-level exams. It's clearly something that the employers and the unions need to sort out. Labour can't say that because their union paymasters are the ones calling the shots. But, you know, all I would say is, you know, there haven't been any negotiations since the 1970s, as far as I'm aware, where it used to be beer and sandwiches with the Prime Minister, where those negotiations took place directly. And I don't, maybe Keir Starmer thinks it should be beer and curry or something. I don't know. The point of this is that the actual unions need to sit down with the employers, because this is a highly technical discussion around 20 different areas of modernisation that are required on the railway to make sure the railways can continue to function after we've given £16 billion of taxpayers' money through coronavirus to make sure that none of those railway employees lost their jobs. So they need to work on this together between the union and the employers.
So is negotiation the only way out of this?
Oh, absolutely. And the crazy thing about this strike is it was called by the union bosses on false pretense that there would be no pay rises. That was never the case, because the pay freeze, which has impacted the entire public sector during coronavirus, had in fact come to an end. But the unions didn't wait. They balloted in April. They called a strike that will inconvenience millions this week. It's totally wrong. It's totally unfair. The average train driver earns £59,000. The average rail worker earns £44,000. The average nurse, £31,000. They do not get a bad deal. We want to pay them more. That has to be done through modernisation.
Is that an argument?
I'm sorry, railways.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is that an argument? You get paid a lot anyway. A lot of other people get paid a lot less.
Well, only in as much as the taxpayer has paid £600 per family for that £16 billion that we propped up the railways by. That's, just put in proportion, £160,000 per railway employee to make sure that no one lost their job through coronavirus. They do get, fortunately, reasonable salaries. I want to see them paid more, but in return, we need to get rid of some of these Spanish practices, which mean that actually, for example, we can't run a railway 7 days a week. Sundays, sometimes some of the rail companies are unable to find people to work because the contracts, the basis of the contracts, date way back, sometimes to 1919, when Sunday wasn't a travelling day as it would be now. So we've got to have the modernisation, and then we'll be able to pay more, but we shouldn't be having strikes about it. This should be a discussion, there should be a negotiation. It should not be, and they've jumped the gun by calling the strikes. I'm afraid not only threatening the public with this disruption, but their own industry and their own jobs by the very fact that people can now use Teams and Zoom and remote working, where that wouldn't been a possibility in the past.
Well, the unions, I want to talk about contracts and funding, because the unions argue, and negotiation, as you say, the unions argue that it's the Treasury and the Department of Transport that control contracts and funding, and so you should be at the table.
Well, as I just explained, I don't name me a strike at which a Secretary of State or a Minister or politicians have been around the table. The employers are the people for the unions to have that discussion with. Indeed, Mick Lynch, who is the head of the RMT, actually said last month that he would never sit down and negotiate, as he put it, with a Tory government. He knows the employers are the only people you can talk to settle this. As I say, there is more money available. That money needs to come in return for reforming some of these so-called Spanish practices, which mean that, for example, we can't maintain the railways as efficiently as we should do using trains and imaging. 70,000 pictures per minute can be taken to check the railways. Instead, we still insist on sending people, usually men, along tracks. It's dangerous. We see deaths because of this, and this is one of the many practices which hasn't been updated because the unions refuse to allow proper modern work practices to come into place.
Well, they say they do want to modernise. They say they do want to modernise, but can the train operating companies offer a pay rise? Because there are reports that they have been told they cannot offer one.
Yes, the train operating companies, indeed, the whole of the public sector has a pay guidance set out by the Treasury. The more reform we can get, the more modernisation, the better that offer can be. But as I say, the biggest point of all is what on earth are they doing going on strike? Why are they stopping people getting to the hospital appointments? Why are they stopping people getting to their GCSEs and A-levels? My daughter included, as it happens, having a much harder journey because of this. Why do that before they've even done the discussions and the negotiations? It's irresponsible. And why aren't Labour, for goodness sake, why aren't Labour calling them out and actually even condemning the strikes? They won't even say that the strikes are wrong because the unions, of course, are paying the Labour Party.
And they're saying, well, why aren't you negotiating? Why aren't you talking? But do you think that a 2 to 3%... We're just going to go around in circles here.
You know, since the 1970s, and it wasn't very successful under Harold Wilson when he used to have beer and sandwiches with union bosses.
Let's move on from the beer and sandwiches. Do you think that a 2 to 3% pay rise is fair when inflation is pushing 11%?
Well, look, first of all, as I say, it's important to know that the average person working on the railway gets £44,000. A nurse, for example, gets £31,000. A care worker, £21,000.
No, but we're specifically talking about inflation. We're not talking...
But I mean, my point is that it's not a badly paid sector. So this is not... We're not talking about people who are terribly paid.
That's not what they're arguing. They're arguing that inflation, they just need... a pay rise that they can actually live with.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I want people to be paid more. I want the rail workers to be paid more. The more reform we can get, the more modernisation that we can get, which, as I say, has been stuck for decades with all manner of practices which just don't belong in the 21st century, then the better service we can run for passengers and the more affordable any pay rise. So I can see there's a route through from where they are by talking to the employers to getting this settled. I cannot understand why they are threatening the public with these strikes, indeed going on strike, and threatening their own sector and their own jobs by jumping the gun to go on strike. It makes no sense, and unfortunately we've got a Labour Party who refuse to condemn these strikes.
Well, a lot of people are saying that actually the public are behind them. But I do want to ask you, if it's all about negotiation and talking things through and coming up with a deal, then what do you think is reasonable for them to be asking for?
Well, again, I just take issue with the idea that the public are behind them. The public have paid £16 billion, £600 per household to keep them in jobs. This is the way that the union barons are thanking the public for all of that money, all of that contribution to making sure not a single person lost their job. I don't accept the premise of your point. Secondly, when it comes to the negotiations, if I can explain, the employers are discussing about 20 different areas of reform. You know, for example, the ability for people who are fully trained and fully skilled to be able to move between one terminal and another terminal in order to provide flexibility to the railway, something at the moment they'll only do with a large inducement payment. These are the sorts of flexibilities that any modern organisation and railway should have, and those are the sort of things which would enable a better settlement for these workers. But to be clear, no one is talking about a pay freeze. All along, there's going to have been a pay rise, and that is why this strike is unnecessary and it should be called off.
So, in terms of the pay rise, what do you think would be reasonable for them to ask for?
Well, as I say, the Treasury sets an overall pay guidance. I think it's 2 or 3% for this year. Clearly, it's not going to be able to be at the level of inflation. If you carry on paying at inflation or above, you carry on getting more inflation.
What about, I'm just going to jump in, what about 7%, 7.1%?
Well, I'm not going to start with due respect to you, on Sky News negotiating in a negotiation that I am not personally involved in. There's a nice offer for you. The more reform that can be produced, the better the offer, but I don't think it will be anywhere near the numbers you're suggesting, no.
So they're saying it's going to continue for 6 months. The summer does not look very bright. Is your only answer this legislation that you're going to bring in where you can bring agency workers in to cover the striking workers? Is that your only solution?
Just correct that. It's not agency workers that we're after. It's transferable skills. I mentioned somebody sitting at a terminal in one of the operation centres not being able to move across and assist at the next one, funnily enough, unless a payment is made. It's that kind of flexibility that's required. It's sorting out the maintenance side and the rest of it. So we'll certainly change the law in order to provide those transferable skills. We'll also change the law separate to that on what we call minimum service levels. It was in our manifesto. It's something that we've said we would do during this 5-year Parliament. It would mean that the entire country wouldn't be brought to a standstill, including freight, including everybody's ability to get to work, and a series of other changes as well. I don't really want to be spending time updating and changing union legislation, but when you have unions who, rather than talk about it, go and ballot for strikes under false pretences, unfortunately, that is where they've led us. And that is, I think, a matter of great regret.
I mean, they'd probably argue, sorry to jump in, they'd probably argue that they are the ones at the table and they are talking, actually, even, until the last hour. But let me just bring it up.
Sorry, just
to
correct that, the employers are at the table as well. The only time, as far as I'm aware, they've not been at the table was the unions on Saturday afternoon when they considered it more important to go and rally at a TUC rally.
And Mr Lynch did refute that. He said that's not what they were doing. But in terms of the agency workers,
and he used pictures of him talking there, right?
In terms of those agency workers, they argue that you won't find people who have the skill set necessary or the security clearance. Is that going to be a problem?
Again, this is, I'm afraid, the unions muddying the picture. We're not, as I said just a moment ago, talking about agency workers. We're talking about people who already work, for example, for Network Rail or a train operating company, but is multi-skilled and can move into another role. But like the classic old union, you can only do the job that you're supposed to be doing that day, contracts that we saw of decades ago. People watching this maybe don't know about how unionised industry used to operate. Like that, it still operates in the railways, and that means we just don't have the flexibility. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra, but you don't know which people will turn up, which musicians, with which instruments, and where they'll sit, because you've got no ability to control any of that, and then expecting the passenger service to run on time. And we just have to move our railways on from those old-fashioned, outdated, outmoded ways of working.